They didn't just steal my land. They stole the silence that kept the neighborhood safe. I bought my home for one reason, the Sentinel Hill in my backyard. It was a 20-foot rise of ancient earth, crowned with gnarled oaks and twisted roots that seemed to weave the very fabric of the sky. It was a fortress of privacy, a prehistoric monolith that blocked out the sterile white picket fence nightmare of Pinecrest Estates. But Marcus Thorne, the HOA president, a man who measured his worth by the height of his neighbor's grass, decided my privacy was an eyesore blocking his view of the valley. While I was away for 48 hours on a business trip, he sent the bulldozers. I didn't come home to a backyard. I came home to a flat, bleeding wound in the dirt. Marcus stood on his balcony, sipping a chilled Chardonnay, and toasted to his new, unobstructed view. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd finally brought order to the neighborhood. What he didn't realize is that the hill wasn't there to block his view. It was there to bury something that has been trying to get out since 1924. The air in the cul-de-sac felt different as I stepped out of my car that Friday evening. It was thinner, sharper, like the atmosphere before a catastrophic storm. The rhythmic growl of the heavy machinery was dying down, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and wrong. I walked to the edge of the property line, my boots sinking into the fresh, pulverized silt. Where the Sentinel Hill had stood for centuries, there was now a leveled plateau of gray mud. The oaks had been mulched into unrecognizable chips. I felt a physical ache in my chest, a phantom limb syndrome for the land itself. Curb appeal, Elias. Think of the equity, Marcus shouted from his terrace, leaning over the railing with a predatory grin. The board unanimously agreed. We've reclaimed the horizon. You'll thank us when you sell. I didn't look up. Couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the center of the destruction. The bulldozers had scraped deep, deeper than necessary for a mere leveling. In the center of the raw earth, something was poking through the mud. It looked like the charred rib of a giant, but as I knelt in the dirt, I realized it was iron. A heavy, rusted link of a chain, as thick as a man's wrist, anchored into something far below the frost line. I didn't file a lawsuit. I didn't call the police. I didn't even scream at Marcus. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon and the automated sprinklers of Pinecrest began their synchronized dance. Then I grabbed my shovel. For the first few hours, I was fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. If they wanted the ground flat, I would dig until I found the bottom of their arrogance. But as the clock struck midnight, the spite turned into a cold, vibrating dread. The deeper I dug around the chain, the warmer the earth became. It wasn't the warmth of a summer day. It was the humid, stifling heat of a throat. The smell hit me next. Not the scent of wet soil, but a metallic, copper tang, like a butcher's shop at closing time. 6 feet down, I hit the lid. It wasn't a coffin. It was a door, made of a wood so dense it felt like stone, bound in that same rusted iron. There were no names, only symbols scratched into the grain, circles within circles, weeping eyes, and dates that predated the town's founding. I realized then that the hill hadn't been a natural formation. It had been a cork, a massive geological seal designed to hold the weight of the world against this door. And Marcus had just popped the top. I should have stopped. I should have covered it back up and fled. But as I looked up at Marcus's house, glowing with its expensive security lights and perfect home aesthetic, a dark, oily thought slid into my mind. They wanted my ground? They could have it. Every bit of it. I spent the next 3 nights in a fever dream of labor. To the neighbors peering through their blinds, it looked like a man broken by grief, trying to rebuild his garden. I was hauling buckets of dirt, but I wasn't just piling it back up. I was mixing it. I found old jars of black salt in the basement of the local library's archives, left behind by the family that owned this land before the HOA paved over their history. I mixed the salt with the copper-smelling mud. I took the warning stones I found around the iron door, stones etched with pleas for mercy, and I placed them in a deliberate, spiraling pattern. I was reconstructing the Sentinel Hill, but I was building it inside out. By Tuesday, the hill was back. It was smaller, sharper, and stood directly in the center of the view corridor Marcus had fought so hard to clear. It looked wrong. The dirt was too dark, almost violet in the moonlight, and it seemed to absorb the light from the street lamps rather than reflect it. On Wednesday morning, the HOA sent a cease and desist notice. Marcus himself walked onto the property, flanked by 2 other board members. They looked triumphant, ready to crush my spirit one last time. "We told you, Elias," Marcus said, his voice tight with a forced, bureaucratic kindness. "No structures, natural or otherwise, above 3 feet. This mound comes down today, or we'll have the sheriff here to remove you." He stepped onto the base of my new hill to emphasize his point. The moment his polished leather shoe touched the dark soil, the air went dead silent. The birds stopped chirping. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marcus froze. A strange expression crossed his face. Not fear, but a sudden, vacant confusion. "Marcus?" one of the board members asked, reaching out. "You okay?" Marcus didn't answer. He was staring at the ground. To him, the hill didn't look like dirt anymore. From his vantage point, the way I had contoured the slopes and placed the warning stones created a perfect, anamorphic optical illusion. He wasn't looking at a hill. He was looking into a massive, yawning mouth that seemed to stretch down into infinity. It's breathing," Marcus whispered, and then the ground actually hummed. A low, subsonic vibration that rattled the windows of every house on the street. The dark soil began to pulse, a rhythmic thumping that mirrored a heartbeat. The visual continuity Marcus wanted had backfired. By flattening the original hill, he had broken the seal. By rebuilding it with the salt and the stones, I had given whatever was underneath a ladder. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the view. The shadows in the cul-de-sac began to stretch toward my backyard, as if the hill were a vacuum, sucking the light out of the neighborhood. I saw Marcus through his bedroom window. He was standing perfectly still, staring out at the mound. He had been there for hours. He couldn't look away. The hill was no longer a hump of dirt. It was a mirror. It was showing him the void he had opened. At 3 a.m., the climax of the horror began. I didn't hear a scream. I heard the sound of earth moving. Not the mechanical grind of a bulldozer, but the wet, sliding sound of a predator moving through tall grass. I looked out and saw the Sentinel Hill had shifted. It was no longer in the center of my yard. It had slid 50 feet to the left, crossing the property line. It was now sitting directly against the foundation of Marcus Thorne's house. The dark, violet mud began to climb the walls. It seeped into the vents. It oozed under the doorframes. The view Marcus wanted so badly was now inside his living room, his kitchen, his lungs. The next morning, the neighborhood was gathered at the edge of my driveway. The police were there, looking baffled. Marcus Thorne's house was gone. It hadn't been knocked down. There was no debris, no broken glass, no splintered wood. There was only a perfectly flat, grassy plain where his $1.2 million mansion had stood. It looked like the most manicured lawn in the world. And in the center of my yard, the Sentinel Hill stood higher than it ever had before. It was lush, green, and beautiful, but the oaks were different now. Their bark looked like stretched skin, and their branches reached out toward the other houses in the HOA, as if measuring them for the next view. The board never bothered me again. In fact, they stopped having meetings altogether. They were too busy keeping their blinds closed, terrified to look out their windows. Because every time the sun sets, the hill shifts just a few inches closer to the next house in the row. I took back my ground. But the ground isn't satisfied. It remembered the taste of the sky, and now that it's been tasted, it wants the whole neighborhood. Every time I hear a rhythmic thumping from beneath my floorboards, I don't get scared anymore. I just smile and check my property line. After all, I'm just a guy who likes a nice, private view. And right now, the view of the empty space where my enemies used to live is absolutely perfect.